Today we're working on a Jatco RE7 R01A, which is also known as a JR710E, and most people call it a 7AT. We took this transmission apart in another video, which is going to be linked down below, and now we're going to put it back together, show you some of the performance stuff we do, and let's get into this. Right now we're going to put these drums back together. Well, obviously we're going to put new rubber in all of these. Transmission assembly lube. More lube up here. We have a balance piston that needs to go in here. After we put our return spring. Compress it and reinstall our snap ring. So now we're going to stack these clutches back up, starting with a cushion plate, flat steel plate, and all of our prick pins and steels. Okay, check the clearance. Everything is in spec. Okay, now we're on to the high-low reverse. It's the same thing, alternating clutch plates and friction plates. And the same deal. Start with a cushion spring. All our clutches and steels. Okay, so this is it with our extra clutch installation, and this is going to make a huge difference in torque capacity. So we're going to fast forward a little bit. We have all our sub-assemblies put together. And off camera, we put in the low reverse piston and retainer, because you're not going to be able to see that when our hands are in there putting it in. All right, so let's get into some of this final assembly. You gotta get this little snap ring to go in, and it's often kind of a pain. There we go. Now our first piece is this clutch hub. Goes down into the case. And hopefully you guys can see this. And these only go in one way. So we went ahead and put our 3 sealing rings on here. And as you can see, these are our 3 bolt holes that bolted into the case, and these are all the oil delivery holes. So this has to go down at what's going to be 6 o'clock in this transmission. And it's a tight fit, so sometimes you got to really gently back and forth with it. See, that sound tells you that it's in there all the way. Next, we have to put in this heavy beveled snap ring, and remember, it's the flat side towards the back. And where you put this in the case doesn't really matter. Some people like to put the opening at 12 o'clock. Some people like to put it at 6 o'clock. It's really whatever is going to be easier. And this thing's kind of a hump to get in. And once it's in, you want to make sure it's seated all the way. All right, next we're going to put this piston in. Return spring. It's a pretty cool spring. And this is another thing that could sometimes be a pain, because you got to push this down while you put the snap ring in. So it's under spring tension while you're doing it. So obviously these castellations in the piston have to match these slots in the return spring. So the idea is you want to push down and get it started. I mean, I'm sure there's tools at the factory level to put this together, but this is how it gets done. So the idea is you got to keep working it around. Sometimes you could get in between these and just kind of rotate your screwdriver to push it in there. All right, so now once it looks like it's all in, you want to push down on this. And if it isn't all the way in, it's going to then seat itself. And again, it's always good practice to give it a couple checks and make sure it's fully in its groove, because this will ruin your day if it pops out. Next, this bearing goes on here. And this one goes on top. After that, we have another set of clutches to go in. Okay, now our cushion spring, again, it sits like a bowl in here. And this is another type of cushion spring. Like this has a little, it's like a spacer that goes in there. And these steel plates kind of go in at any clock position, unlike the last set that we put in. Okay, this is our low and reverse clutch pack. And this is something, we don't get too crazy on the clearance because it's not really relevant. We're not modifying anything, but just want to make sure there's a little clearance and that the clutches turn freely. Okay, so now we have our direct drum, and all these splines have to spline into these clutches. Got to make sure they're lined up. When you hear that sound, that means it's down all the way. All right, next we got to put this high-low reverse drum in. So what we're going to do is get this Planetary and engage our sun gear into it. So what we have to do is simultaneously spline these clutches in, and these tabs have to engage into here. And as you can see, this looks like it's down all the way. So now we got to pick it up like this, hold everything like this. Now we have to spline this into these clutches. And that went a little bit easier than they usually do. But this is all in. Now, make sure our bearing is here. There's no race. This bearing rides directly against this sun gear. This is a hardened surface here. So same thing. We want these tabs to engage into here. All right, next we have this Planetary. We've stuck our bearing on here with assembly grease and the bearing on the other side. That sits in there like that. Next, we could put our whole input clutch assembly in. That sound tells us it's home. Next, we have to put this drum in. Planetary, drum, and the one-way clutch is on top. So now this wide area has to fit here. Next, we have this snap ring. And we have a set of clutches. All right, next we're going to put this sun gear in. Got a bearing here. We have our race here. And as you can see, we have our pump pressure hole and our pump suction hole here and here. And this is what we're going to use as our reference to get it straight. So essentially has to go down in this position. I don't know if we got extremely lucky, because usually we have to mess around with getting these clutches to spline in. So we do that by moving these drums around here. We got lucky. See that sound? That tells us this hit home. Okay, so when we're working on something, you always got to make sure it's down, and then you want to check to see that it has end play after we put a couple bolts in. Well, so now you got to remember, you need to hear that sound, right? You don't want to run this down with the bolts if it's not down already, because now you're going to end up bending clutches and it's a misassembly. So we're just going to pretty gently put these down. we're going to establish that A, the shaft turns, and B, I don't know if you can see that we have a little bit of end play. And that's about 10-15 thousandths, which is perfect. Now to put these pump bolts in, we've got to put silicone on all of them so they don't leak. So we put a nice blob on all of these. Then we're going to torque these all to 20 foot-pounds. And of course, we want to double check all of them. And double check that we could turn this shaft by hand, which we can. Now, up on the bench, make sure everything's moving nicely in here. So you see you have two sensors that are in your valve body, and they pick up on these rings, right? This is an exciter wheel for the one input shaft speed sensor, and this is the exciter wheel for the other input shaft speed sensor. Okay, we'll also double check our clutch clearances. Okay, so next we're going to go ahead and put our output shaft in. We're going to stick this bearing on the back. There we go. Sometimes it's a bit of a trick, but again, other parts of the video, you know that sound. When you hear metal to metal, that typically means that something is in all the way. Okay, next we're going to put our support bolts in. But what I like to do is squirt a little bit of oil, because this torque is critical. And automotive 101, if you're torquing something, technically you're supposed to have oiled bolts. So I like to bring these down slowly and evenly. Then we're going to go ahead and torque them to 20 foot-pounds. All right, now we're going to air check it, which is going to tell us if we have hydraulic integrity in here, that all our sealing rings are good and all the rubber in the drums is good. And if this doesn't air check well, you better take it back apart, because there's something wrong and it's not going to work correctly. So we don't have a dyno. This is, again, if you have proper end play, all your clutches apply, and you're doing this for long enough, you know this thing is going to be right and work properly. So here is our first. And the idea is you want to blow a little bit of air and be able to feel it backing up. And some will be 100%, like for example, if it's going directly to the pump and there's no sealing rings involved. Same thing back here. And you can see these clutches moving. So that's applying this. And some of them you got to seal off because these drums are double fed. And this thing is about as good as they get as far as an air check. All right, the next thing we're going to do is put the speed sensor in. If you see, it's got a raised tab, and that's going to locate it into that hole. And we have to kind of sneak this wire through here. And as a side note, this thing uses your parking gear as an exciter ring to give your computer a signal of output shaft speed. And a lot of times there's a code that shows up in these transmissions, which is a P0720, which is an output speed sensor malfunction. However, that code has nothing to do with the sensor. It's a false code, and it usually means that your TCM that sits on top of your valve body is bad. Okay, we're going to need to put this bearing race on the output shaft. You see there's a step where it sits, and this other bearing goes in your tail housing. Next, we have this other piece that guides your parking mechanism, and I put a little grease there to kind of hold it in place while it gets assembled. Next, we have our parking pole. This pin engages here, and then we have a return spring. Oops. That sits in here. So take note that it sits here and here. And if it's working, it's going to be pushing your parking pole back into the non-park position. Now here you could either do silicone or a gasket. We're going to use a gasket today. It's a little bit neater for filming purposes. Don't be alarmed by this lack of anything that it's touching. So now when we put this on, we're going to need to engage this parking rod into the parking mechanism. Now what's nice is this pin that sticks out engages into this hole, so it kind of gets everything straight for you as you're putting it on. And it should go on just like that, with no resistance, or it shouldn't be popped up or anything like that. And again, the spec here is 20 foot-pounds. All right, now we're putting this valve body back on. So there's a few things that have to happen here. We have a case connector that needs to engage here. We have two speed sensors that need to engage into these two holes. And this manual valve is going to need to engage into this tab. So we'll get our speed sensor wires out of the way. Turn it over. Got our connector started. This is how the manual valve needs to sit in there. Our bracket for the speed sensor. These two corner bolts, which are a little shorter than the others. Next two bolts. This one's real important. This is a special shoulder bolt. As you can see, it's got a raised shoulder on it, and it fits in this hole. You see how this hole's smaller than this hole? That's because between these two things, this is what locates the valve body, so it's in perfect alignment. So when we're putting these together, this is the bolt we always have to tighten first before any of the other ones. We've got a few more that are longer, and the longer ones all go through the filter. Except for this one, which goes in that corner. So again, this bolt gets tightened first. Possible. And the speed sensor engages into this hole here. And we hold it down with the brackets. Another important step is this little spring clip. Put this here, and this is what prevents this connector from pushing back up into the transmission case. Next is our pan. Next is the bell housing. Right, now we're going to put this lockup O-ring on. It's a pretty obvious groove where it goes. I want to groove it up. Front seal was already lubed, but we'll hit it again. Now, the two manual lever shaft seals. Kind of be careful to get these over the shaft. And I'm only going to do one of these because the other one's the same exact thing, so you guys don't need to see it twice. And put on our shift lever. And the other thing we always want to do is check to make sure that we have torque. And last thing is to put this back on. This is all our ID information for this unit. So don't be a dick, put it back on. Please like, share, subscribe, and hit the notification bell.